I just want to go back to the voting section of this bill and ask a few more questions. In terms of early voting, which we passed earlier on in the year, has there been any funding provided by the state to our counties to fund early voting in the state of New York?
It's not in this bill. It will be in the bill, but it is $10 million.
$10 million.
Correct.
Now, before, it was my understanding the estimates were up to $27 million. Did that include a portion of the electronic poll books?
Right. So there's 10 million for the operations, and then there's 14.7 million for the poll books and the to support the operations of that. So,
do you know if that's sufficient to cover the costs of the early voting this year on the municipalities?
we believe that that's the minimum amount they need to be able to be able to implement early voting for this year.
Thank you very much for that. In terms of the extending the primary hours for the upstate counties, is there any money allocated in this budget for that purpose?
The 10 is 10. So no, the 10 million is for the early voting, not for the additional times.
Okay, so though we're mandating the upstate counties to provide additional hours, there is no funding in this budget to help them with this unfunded mandate.
Not tied directly to the early voting, but as we'll discuss later on this evening, there are additional sales tax revenues coming to the county, so we think that there'll be sufficient new revenues to cover any increased costs.
Okay, very good. If I could just turn to the voter in terms of the online voting registration system. Is there sufficient funds allocated through the State Board of Elections budget to operate this platform?
Didn't we gave them? $5 million, right? Right. We do reappropriate the $5 million from last year for the staffing at the State Board of Elections to allow for additional costs related to this.
Okay, and in terms of if you want to register online, do you do it through one platform, the State Board of Elections, or could you do that through multiple platforms like County Board of Elections?
Well, there is a 2-year implementation time before it's effective, so I think some of those issues will be resolved as the State Board moves towards developing the system.
All right, I'd like to turn back to that 3 hours of voting now, if you would not mind.
Sure.
Is it from discussing this earlier with you, you're saying that we're just extending it from a 2 to a 3 hour period. Is that correct?
Right, that's the allowable time, but it's up to the 3 hours. It's not that you get a 3-hour window. If the polling site is around the corner or down the a few blocks away, you obviously don't need the 3 hours unless there are long lines. So that's the maximum amount of time, but it should be the amount of time actually needed to vote.
Okay, I just want to make it clear. Is it your understanding, and you've had a lot of information, you've done a great job today answering all these questions, there's been a tremendous amount of information, but is everyone allowed a 2-hour period right now under current law?
Well, the language that we don't change, we eliminate 2, we say 3 hours, and then we say in the current law, take off, so 3 hours, take off so much working time as will enable him or her to vote at any election. So it's not that you get you get this window, but we do remove, as was discussed earlier, we do remove the current section of law that says that if you do have, that if you have 4 consecutive hours of not being at work, that you don't get the benefit of that 2-hour time frame. So
thank you
sure.
very much, Madam Chairman, for that point, because right now, how I interpret the current law is if you have 4 hours before your shift or 4 hours after your shift, before, the polls open or close, you're not entitled to that 2 hours right now. Would that be your understanding under current law?
Yes.
Okay. Now, under the revised law, would it be your understanding that every employee, regardless of that time period that we just discussed, would be entitled to 3 hours of paid time by their employer to vote?
Up to 3 hours at the beginning of their work day or at the end of their work day.
Okay, so it is a significant change, because if someone is working, between the hours of 8 and 4, they still have 5 hours at their end of the shift to go vote, and they don't have to take the 2 hours or the 3 hours to have done that under the current law.
Yes, but as we also discussed, there are people who work multiple jobs, there are people who have family responsibilities, maybe people work for the state legislature and their hours change on certain days.
Okay, I have another question about that. So, who makes a determination about the shift before or after? Is that the employer or the employee to when they can go out and vote during this 3-hour period?
The employees required to give 2 hours notice, so I would hope that would be something that could be 2 days notice. Right. The employee notifies the employer not less than 2 working days before the day of the election that they require the time off, unless otherwise mutually agreed. Only the beginning or the end of their shift, but there can be some discussion and some agreement to work that out.
Okay, so we've established that under the proposed law, everyone is entitled to, if they elect so, to have 3 hours of paid time off at the beginning or the end of their shift.
Up to what's needed to vote.
Okay. I'm sure many people would take the full 3 hours to do that, but it's up to. So if you're operating a manufacturing company with a shift of, let's say, 100 people, theoretically, you could have 50 people at the beginning of the shift and 50 people at the end of the shift off, paid by the employer to go out and vote.
I must tell you that we have not heard of problems with the existing law, albeit, I'll concede that there is that 4-hour window that you couldn't take advantage of, but we have not heard of problems. We don't think that this change will have such a dramatic impact as has been described by many of the members.
And I guess I would just submit to you, Madam Chairwoman, is that because of how the existing law is written, for most shifts, that would work out where they have a 4-hour period on either side to make that accommodation. Now, if you, on your own time, go out and do early voting, and then you change your mind, you want to go to the polling site on election day, do they get that 3 paid hours?
Well, as we joked about that, often someone will say vote early and often, but you can only vote once in New York State.
Okay.
So if you voted early voting, you can't then go and vote on election day.
All right. I have another question for you. Now, with early voting, which is 8 or 9 days, with the strong possibility that within 2 more years we'll have no excuse absentee voting, why do we need to have 3 hours of paid time by employers to the employees to vote when we have these other opportunities for individuals in the city of New York to vote? Why do we need to do this? We have 2 other alternatives that is wide open for them to go vote.
Well, first of all, we don't have that, the sort of no excuse absentee voting yet, so obviously we can see what happens in that regard. People, we're not saying that if people want to go vote in person, they should be entitled to do that, exercise their constitutional right to vote without being forced to have to, once it becomes law, vote by absentee. And as I mentioned, there are people who have lots of responsibilities that prevent them from being able to either do their early voting or vote there on a day they would otherwise be working. And I think most workers in our state are very conscientious and are not looking just for time off. They're looking to exercise their right to vote, and there have been problems where people have not been able to do that, either because of their long commutes or their multiple jobs, their family responsibilities, parental responsibilities, care of relatives. So we just want to ensure that all citizens who want to vote have an opportunity to vote.
Thank you very much for answering my questions on the bill.
On the bill, sir.
In terms of the 3-hour paid voting, which is a substantial change from the current law, as we discussed earlier with the 4 hours on either side, where you're not allowed the 2-hour voting. This is a substantial mandate on all businesses in the state of New York. This is a substantial mandate on all the municipalities who have workers working on election day. And there are alternatives. We have early voting, which is in statute, starting this November, for 8 days prior to election day. It's there. I'm hopeful that we will have no excuse absentee voting. I was very proud to support that first passage of the constitutional amendment, and I hope before the end of 2021, that will be law. So I just believe that this is unnecessary with the avenues and the opportunities right now for us to exercise and proudly exercise our right to vote. And therefore, I will be voting against this budget bill. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.